We have with us two speakers. One is Dinesh Abrol, who was in the National Institute of Science, Technology and Development Studies, the STATS. We have Vineeta, who's Vineeta Bal. She is a scientist in National Institute of Immunology, has been active on a number of issues, including on the science popularization.
I think even when we want to talk about the last 1 year, it's good to relate them to the issues which arise from the context in which we are discussing. That's the idea of India. See, science, reason, modern science in particular, played an important role in the idea of nation building as far as Indian experience goes. Modern science was characterized at that time by very rapid growth immediately in the wake of the post-World War, when the world was getting decolonized, and the decolonized world wanted to actually adopt modern science and utilize science. And its importance was realized in a society even which was characterized by semi-feudal, feudal dominance, and also the whole idea of having been oppressed by colonial world, had lost its own confidence, and it actually needed to generate confidence, and it wanted to utilize science. And in fact, if you look at the ideas which whether Nehruvians or whether Gandhians or everybody committed to the method of science, but in fact, if you read all these leaders, even when they are talking about that, science and religion can coexist, they do not compromise on the method of science. In fact, if you read even in the discovery of India, when Nehru wrote about how he looks at science and religion, he wanted religion to be tempered by reason, he wanted it to be tempered by what we said the scientific temper actually needs to guide and us. And even when he recognized the Indian history that was in which science had contributed for quite some ages, he took note of it. Even Gandhi, about whom people understand in variety of ways, etc. If you read him at the time of the independence, I think in 1949 or so, when he was addressing the Ayurvedic practitioners, and he was talking to them saying that you need to learn a lot from the new medicine. The new medicine as that was emerging, which utilized science and based on science, and in fact there is a full study has been undertaken and it was published in Economic and Political Weekly. So the kind of advice that he used, how the method of science is important and the way it should be utilized in the development of even the Ayurveda as a system of knowledge and medicine. And of course, there were people who were atheists, like Bhagat Singh, or there were people from within the left who actually had obviously commitment to the method of science right through, etc. If you look at that's the other person who was the father of the Indian Constitution in a way, when headed the Constitutional Assembly, he identified the scientific method with justice, with actually fighting against the hierarchy and the discrimination with the Dalits faced and so on. And so to him, religion needed social reform. For Nehru's, religion needed social reform. The science and society relationship was to be rethought in terms of that how social reform gets carried out, and then scientific temper would become a larger number of people within the country, and that's how actually the country would be able to embrace modernity, country would be able to take progress. These are the core ideas which I think were shared ideas, while there were differences within among the people who were playing role in the freedom struggle or immediately after independence were helping India to reconstruct itself. If you look at even in the Indian Parliament, there was across board the support to the fact that of the scientific policy resolution, which was both working for self-reliance as well as for reason, for the establishment of reason. And in fact, in the SPR, which is 1958, you realize that the commitment that the Indian nation had put in to saying how India can contribute to science. So see, even its notion of its ecumenical notions of science, history, were built into that. The science has been contributed by Indians. They can contribute. They have much more potential if scientific temperament is built, because we have seen periods during which the caste system and many other obscurantists and other institutions have come in the way of the development of science. And I think that's where the struggle is needed in against those particular ideas. But what we see in the case of Modi, developments which we are wanting to talk about in the last 1 year, it is very contrary to what were the principles or what were the values which were shared by the people of the freedom struggle. In fact, the mumbo jumbo to which not only the Indian Science Congress was witness to, and it was or even the other gatherings in which Modi has spoken, or Rajnath Singh has spoken, or even Harshvardhan has spoken, has nothing in common with the fact what Nehruvians wrote about it, or Ambedkarites wrote about, or the leftists wrote about, or Bhagat Singh wrote about. Any of these people, if you look at that, these are people who are talking of details would be taken up surely by Vineeta of what happened at the Indian Science Congress, the kind of 7 papers that were presented there and what do they signify. And see, but one thing is very clear, that the kind of commitment to the method of science which they showed was not shown in any of the utterances or any of the papers that were presented in the Indian Science Congress. That is one thing. And it is amazing that first time in the history of the Indian Science Congress that you saw the political leadership actually committing itself on, rather than to the method of science, but to the mumbo jumbo. That's the kind of and talking of wanting to establish the glory of the Indian sciences were evolving. They were evolving in a multicultural context of exchange between exchange with Arabs, with Greeks, and but here there is a further talks of how Pythagoras theorem was invented by us. And actually we have been very graceful, and we have allowed actually the Greeks to take credit for it. Or Heisenberg principle and the uncertainty principle, Heisenberg learnt it from us as far as there's a whole politics to it which you need to, I think we need to take into account, that if you look in these utterances, that much of the talk that they with regard to the contribution of the Indian sciences being made, whether it is Vimana or whether it is abstract ideas of physics, they think they all come from Veda. Now, they don't talk about anything about the medieval period. It is very clear that in the kind of glory and glorification which we see, which was practiced in the Indian science from the side of the political leadership, it was for the first time. It never happened as far as ever in the past, and this is a very, very disturbing sign. But if you look at the rankings of the Indian science, have been going down. As far as it is concerned, all the indicators which you today find that the Indian institutions in practicing or cultivating science, and in fact, are going through a period of crisis. And this crisis has been there over the period of reforms, actually, as we see right from the time the reform period began. And I think whether you look at it in terms of expenditure, look at it in terms of the institution building efforts which are as they have been practiced and so on, etc., the kind of lack of completely democratization. At one time, Nehru himself used to be the president of the Indian Association of Scientific Workers of India, and we saw it during the period of Murli Manohar Joshi, in fact, that kind of undemocratic thing settling in within even CSIR, of which I was very much part. And I think if you combine it with the kind of today the treatment that the Indian science has been met with, many of the institutions are headless, etc. It's a matter of serious concern, and they've been headless for quite some time as far as it's concerned in a variety of places. But I think since we are, probably discuss in the context of self-reliance, Make in India, Digital India, and whatnot in this particular notion, the science is not at the center of it. Somebody else should come and make it for India. So, if you, Modi is obviously, as I said, that is satisfied with the past glory, which is also a falsehood. about what is real actually is not being talked about. As far as what are the actual contributions of the Indian science and technology, they have not been focused on, because maybe they don't belong to the period of Rig Veda. That is what, and it is very important for them to establish that idea. Like if you see RSS, what it tried saying, all the human race is born Hindu. You know, humans have been born Hindus. It's only they later get converted into some other religions, That's the kind of a science that they believe in, as far as though I think when they want to, as a result, obviously they take certain kind of stances as far as are concerned. Science as a source of morality, source of new values, whether it is in the context of climate change, whether it is in the, we didn't know about the problem of climate change till a few decades ago. It is science which has enabled us to actually understand and climate change. So, and it is allowing us to develop new values within the society, making a part of the contribution. And I think that the nation builders expected from science were the genuine expectations from science, and the science has been able to deliver quite a lot. While it needs to be democratized, it needs to be reconstructed in terms of ways it should be practiced and it should be developed is another matter. But I think it has held on far more robustly than any other institution or any other system of knowledge production which you might know of having been practiced in this particular case. Even in the case of indigenous knowledge, these issues were raised. There are a lot of knowledge from which we can benefit. But in many of these particular areas also, over the period, the claims which were added, they also would have to be verified, and you need to upgrade it. Our own experience of people science movement, when we intervene in people's technology, we realize whether it is the leather workers, or whether it is the people who are committed to food, practicing occupations of fruit and vegetable processing, they would need an indigenous knowledge to be, or biodiversity to be utilized with the help of the science. And that's why the blending of technology, science and indigenous knowledge, the way it should occur obviously in terms of the saying that it actually allows the oppressed, the most disempowered people to actually gain power. Science was for social reform, science was for justice, science was to be linked to the fact to end inequality, science was to be linked not to profit, obviously, as far as it's concerned, and was to be linked to the notions of nation building, which actually involved modernity and progress, to which Modi and RSS and BJP don't remain committed. So they don't remain committed to either even internationalism of the kind which we saw at the time, because we had seen fascism at that particular point of time, remember that, and that opposition to fascism required, and the way, because the Nazis had dealt with science, and we realized that the way the science needs to be dealt with. J.D. Barnard, who was not only very much in touch with Nehru and he kept on, these are the people who were shaping what kind of institution building, what kind of role that science needs to be assigned to at that particular period. Now, if you look at this whole internationalism which Modi is practicing today, and rightly Vijay was trying to say, why can't we link ourselves with whether Africa, Latin America, that and for the purposes that we need to link it to, he is only going and saying very different kind of internationalism in science as needs to be practiced. I think we heard about the way the nuclear or various other areas which have been dealt with, or Make in India which have been dealt with, and I think the challenge lies in the fact that we now today create a resistance to the very way they are perceiving the role of science, and very contrary to what the modern builders of the Indian nation conceived, and the kind of dangerous precedent that it is setting, apart from building intolerance, building status quo, restoring that should not be acceptable. See, how do we really actually resist? I think there's a last point which I want to make, that finally the battle from below is as important as battle against the way the top is functioning, because fascism is largely mobilized and mobilization, political mobilization as it is done, unless you resist that political mobilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh, particularly like all speakers having to finish in time. It's a difficult exercise. Vineeta.
Thank you. The question that I want to pose in the first place, and I'll go along with that, is society which here at the moment is represented by intellectuals, academicians, civil society, people, activists, has it actually internalized the connection of science and reason? Let me begin by sort of defining what is science. And it's a process of acquiring knowledge. It investigates natural phenomena through observation, theoretical explanation, and experimentation. So it's also to do with model building. One puts forward a hypothesis and starts observing or experimenting depending on the expertise. For example, social scientists also become part of this pursuit of science, as well as biomedical scientists, engineers, and biologists like me. So using a combination of approaches, we look at addition of knowledge, and that's what we think of as science in the larger context. And what one has to remember is that what we have as information today is never an absolute truth, and we will never be able to achieve the absolute truth. This relativity of the science or the truth is something that is very hard to accept and understand. And when you have so much of information available, what is proven, repeatedly proven by multiple people, it stands the test of time, is an important point to understand, and that's where the rationality or reasonableness associated with science comes into picture. There are almanacs, there are horoscopes, there are daily projections of how your day will be, and all of these are part of our lives, and I'm sure the audience here is also not an exception. So if the hypothesis or what are considered as facts in astrology are not really the facts, are we rational human beings in believing what the horoscopes tell us, what the almanac tell us, and should we be basing our lives, including Vastu Shastra and whatever else, to live the life the way we live? That's why science and reason are not easily, the connectivity of it is not easily acceptable by a large section of the people, and we need to think about it more seriously. This astrology also brings me to the earlier avatar of this NDA government. About 12-13 years ago, the NDA government led by Atul Bihari Vajpayee had introduced a course in astrology and thinking or proposing it as a science. And that's where the problems were. Murli Manohar Joshi was responsible for pushing it through, but there were also fortunately many other scientists within India and outside, including physicists and astrophysicists, who put forth their resistance. And what we see today is that astrology has not disappeared from many universities. It is still taught, it is still possible to get a degree, including a PhD in astrology, but fortunately, for people like me, I suppose, that it is not part of natural science. It is either part of Sanskrit language and the subsidiary curricula of that, or something in humanity. So it is fortunately not being treated as a real science, which is in a sense useful. And when we are talking about almanac and sort of connection to rationality, I can't help but not bring in names of two people. One was Dr. Narendra Dabholkar, who was murdered because he was actually against irrationality, or he was a proponent of rationality. He was against superstition, and he was trying to propose a law, get it approved in the state of Maharashtra. He was murdered. Earlier this year, Comrade Govind Pansare, who was also supporting Dabholkar in this aspect and in many others, was also murdered. So what does this tell us? That rationality and scientific thoughts are possibly not easily acceptable to people, and such people meet violent death. This is something that is really a problem for us to think about. Let me also talk about what Mr. Modi, our Prime Minister, talked in a hospital in Bombay when he was inaugurating. This was a Reliance supported hospital. He talked about Karna and mentioned it as a creation of genetic science. I suppose the advisors that he has are probably not the real experts. I'm sorry to say this, but it was not genetic science. What we call as assisted reproductive technology is possibly what can be invoked to explain, if one wants to explain how Karna was born. But one has to remember that even for Pandavas and Kauravas, the same assisted reproductive technology can be invoked as an explanation if one wants to find it. There was nothing sort of genetic science in it. The other problem, the other reference that Modi made was even more problematic for me, and it was about plastic surgery. He said that the head of the elephant was very skillfully put onto a human body to make God Ganesh. You know, there are sort of stages in which where how far back or how ridiculous can one become. So I was talking about mystery becoming history and becoming science. Now we are invoking gods. So gods have transcended all these steps and have suddenly become the reality. And I should tell you this for sure, that stitching an elephant head onto human body needs plastic surgery, but that skill is not in itself by sufficient. By training, I am an immunologist, and it's a foreign an object from a different genus altogether, which is being fitted onto a human being, and there are many issues which what we call as transplantation rejection that we have not resolved even today, and there is no real successful long-lasting transplant from another genus like pigs or monkeys or mice onto human beings which have been successful. As an ironical point, I suppose I can also say that when we are talking about, if we take the statement about the god Ganesh seriously, it's the elephant head and the brain that was coming from the elephant which seems to be providing so much of wisdom and knowledge to the Indian community. That's what the Hindu mythology is all about, or Hindu religion is all about, that we think of God Ganesh as a god for knowledge. Let me go to the example of what Dinesh was also referring about, Indian Science Congress. The Congress which took place in January this year was the first one after Modi government came to power, and it had one session called Ancient Sciences through Sanskrit. And it talked about Vaimanika Shastra claims, and there were many issues, and I see that also about the time. There was a paper which was published in 1974 by some of the people, some of the scientists from India, and this was their conclusion, that the planes described are at the best poor concoctions rather than expressions of something real. None of the planes has properties or capabilities of being flown. The geometries are unimaginably horrendous from the point of view of flying, and so on and so forth. The text, which was supposed to be ancient science, was apparently dated to early 20th century. Year after year after year, the scholarship takes a back seat. You may have a technology today, but that was based on the scholarship that has been going on for these years, and that scholarship needs some funding, and this funding is also not really taken seriously. And I think we need to take this point about mythology, which is leading to history, leading to science, as seriously questionable, and the Modi government's push for development and industrialization when they are not putting any emphasis on scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Vineeta has already raised this issue, that what we are treating mythology as history and mythology as science. And the problems with that is that fundamentally science can also be used for history, and you can analyze with methods of science, as it were, also with the what we can find analyzing artifacts of history. Treat this as scientifically, therefore history is also in this sense science, because you use the method of science to history, including what we can find archaeologically. And when you present history as mythology, what you're doing is you don't have any need for evidence. You do away with rationality itself as an instrument for analyzing your past, and therefore the test of what is truth, what is real, what is unreal disappears. You can then say anything you want without need to produce any evidence of this. Indian science has glorious past. It has an inglorious technology because it was embedded in a caste system. Therefore, those who worked with the hands could not access knowledge. Those who could access knowledge despised people who worked with their hands, and that is therefore a problem. But it had made major advances. In medieval period, we had major advances in India. There is a lot of advances in astronomy, mathematics, which fortunately didn't require too much implements of the hand to work with. So you had advances you made. That's a glory of Indian science as well. But what we see here is a vain glory regarding your past and not really the glory of Indian science. I would also touch upon this issue of make in India and made in India, and what's the difference between the two. The difference between make in India is science and technology. Knowledge is not a part of this. You can come here, bring your knowledge, bring your technology, bring your capital, you own it, just make it here. Use our cheap labor. We'll provide you a market, use our cheap labor. So it's an offer not for development but for enslavement. So what you're asking is, East India Company comes and say, hey, very good, you're coming to India, damn good, you know. So what we are really talking about, this difference of make in India in made in India, is that science and technological development was embedded in a process which would make things in India. It is what used to be called the license permit Raj. Yes, it had its problems, but it says you have to transfer technology. You have to give a phased program, manufacturing program, which will indigenize. And of course, there are problems of that because it's sort of, as technology became made more and more dynamic, there are problems that were coming. But the solution was that, that you develop science and technology even further, and you should be on the cutting edge of that to develop the next generation of technology, not just indigenize. So the problem of not being able to indigenize fast enough with the changing technological world was converted to giving up indigenization altogether, and giving up therefore the link that science and technology has with industry, giving it up altogether and saying you can buy all the technology you want, invite all the capitalists of the world to come and set up institutions here, set up industry here, and you don't have to develop science and technology in India. So you have the only part of Indian science and technology which is still important are then space and nuclear, because these are two things which others will not give you. They come with what are called dual use technologies. They're a part of missiles, they're a part of nuclear weapons and so on. So you have this part of it which others won't give you. Therefore you have to develop yourself. Is the only last bastion, if you will, of indigenized in science and technology. All others are being progressively given up. And we saw this, the vainglory of science, not only with respect to past, but we had the Mangalyaan. We shoot the Mangalyaan, and after its success, Mr. Modi is there. The ISRO chief is not allowed to speak even one sentence. Mr. Modi speaks for 30 minutes on the great achievement that was done, including the laboratory he visited in Ahmedabad, and how therefore somehow he contributed to the Mangalyaan. The scientists who were sitting there are not even mentioned except just in the passing. Sarabhai, who's from Gujarat, who founded the space program, is not even mentioned once. Past contributions of the Indian scientific community towards the Mangalyaan is not mentioned. He appropriates the entire credit. So this is the kind of relationship this leadership seems to want to do with science. I will end with the last part, that we are seeing today a battle of what is called net neutrality. It's a very esoteric battle. I'm not going to discuss it in detail, but it's really a battle about how you control your economic space. And China is the only one who's controlled its economic space on the internet. It is able to therefore have a Baidu, a Alibaba or Tencent, who are now in the global internet monopolies, they also figure out of the top 10, 3 are Chinese. Only because they have really protected their economic space with what's called the Great Firewall of China. Here, Mr. Zuckerberg comes to India. He speaks with Mr. Modi, and we seem to have given him, it appears, unless that to go back on that, a green signal to set up this internet.org with Reliance, and that will be the model for providing access to Indian people. That internet access to Indian people, which is really knowledge, information, various things, will all be done through Mr. Zuckerberg's Facebook, internet.org. So you're handing over your economic space to Facebook, and Facebook's calculation is all of us who are on Facebook are worth $4 as revenue for it, because it sells advertisements. It sells us to the advertisers. So we are really products on Facebook. So this is the last bastion, as it were, of free space left, which also seems to be given up as economic space to the Facebooks of the world. And it seems that the government of India has a tacit understanding the so-called zero rating they will actually give them. I'll only end with saying that ultimately the agency of change are people. So it's people who use knowledge and science to change society. And if we put the agency on science itself, then we'd be making a mistake, either for peace or for war. So either way, the agency lies with us to resist as well as to create a new society which is built on a different order. And we should not confuse capitalism and science and technology as things that we can exchange between each other. Capitalists have agency, people have agency. Science does not have agency, technology does not have agency. Thank you very much. We end this session. Thank you very much.